Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I appreciate the chairman allowing me to wave on to this subcommittee as a member of the National Security Subcommittee of this full committee, the ranking Republican on the National Security Subcommittee, member of the House China Task Force, and a member of the Asia Pacific Subcommittee on House Foreign Affairs Committee. This topic is of acute interest to me. And I want to thank the witnesses for the outstanding testimony. It's been very, very helpful as we consider legislative response to the challenge of China and Western capital flows to China. Earlier this year, I introduced the Chinese Military and Surveillance Company Sanctions Act, which has received broad support from my colleagues on both the Financial Services Committee and the Foreign Affairs Committee. The bill seeks to address one of the problems we're discussing here today: malign Chinese entities using American capital to fuel efforts that directly counter U.S. national security interests. The bill expands on President Trump's executive order targeting Chinese military companies as amended by President Biden's executive order, and my bill takes it a step further. Instead of simply banning investment in public equity issued by these companies, it directs the president to actively sanction them. Mr. Lorber and Ms. Chu, can you all elaborate on why a bill like mine, which leverages the U.S. sanctions regime, is preferable to a ban on public equity investment, as was the case with the executive orders, or enhanced disclosures such as the Holding Foreign Companies Accountable Act? And by the way, Mr. Chairman, I supported your bill, the Holding Foreign Companies Accountable Act, because Chinese companies are not playing by the same rules as other foreign companies. And I support your bill to accelerate the timeline to 2 years. But that legislation is an investor protection bill. It is not a foreign policy or national security bill. So what do sanctions achieve that these disclosures do not, Mr. Lorber?
Thank you, Representative Barr. The primary differences between the current executive orders that are in place that you referenced and the proposed legislation is the scope of the prohibition. So right now, under the current executive orders, the companies that are identified, U.S. persons are prohibited from transacting in publicly traded securities, but that's it. By actually designating the entities that are contained on the list, you would actually prohibit U.S. persons from transacting with them in any way. In addition, the scope of the executive order is limited to the specific companies that are identified on the list, but by blocking them, by adding them to the SDN list, you would actually automatically include any companies that those listed entities own or control. So the scope of it would be much, much broader.
And Ms. Chu, when you answer the question, could you also explain the mechanics of OFAC designations? So in other words, take an index like MSCI or BlackRock's announcement on August 30th that it would triple American investments in China. Explain how that might change and alter the composition of these index and these investments.
Thank you for the question. So in the past 3 years, I believe it was May 2018 when MSCI began or announced I was going to begin including Chinese A shares in its indices. The exposure of U.S. investors to A shares, which are companies listed on the Shanghai and Shenzhen exchanges, has shot up exponentially. There were none at that point, only H shares and ADRs. And so I believe that applying sanctions to Chinese military companies and Chinese surveillance companies, in addition to existing restrictions on capital investment, would be an ideal way to align national security objectives across sanctions programs.
Now, when OFAC were sanctioned these entities, the MSCI and the index would presumably have to pull out those designated firms from their index. Is that correct?
Right. I believe that the executive orders and the OFAC implementation require divestment by securities or exposure to these securities, but it was unclear, and there are a lot of index providers and investment companies that were struggling for a long time, especially ended last year, to figure out if they were supposed to implement this, if there were any sort of enforcement measures. So I believe those factors should all be made more clear and potentially an amendment to the ways that these capital market sanctions and restrictions can be applied.
And Mr. Lorber, can you talk about the force multiplier of sanctions versus U.S. securities disclosures in terms of preventing a circumvention and a rerouting of capital to foreign exchanges?
Yeah, exactly. It's a good point. So there is the usual occurrence where when the U.S. government, for example, OFAC sanctions somebody, as long as there's U.S. jurisdiction, non-U.S. companies are obliged to follow those rules and regulations. And so what you would see is oftentimes non-U.S. persons, non-U.S. companies operating in foreign jurisdictions wouldn't touch those securities because they would be blocked property. So there would be a significant extension of the impact beyond just U.S.
It would have a multilateral impact.
Yeah.
My time has expired, Mr. Chairman. Thank you very much and appreciate your leadership on the disclosures front. We're just making the point that OFAC is another important tool. Yield back.